Mayor Michael Bloomberg, Florida Governor Charlie Crist, and Congressman Michael Castle of Delaware. Topics include redistricting and election reform. Columbia University in New York hosts this event. This is 30 Minutes.
Lay out for everybody some of the things that you put out, not only in the press release today, about how gerrymandered and non-competitive our electoral process is, but also why that is such a problem.
Well, the reason that it exists is that people always act rationally, or virtually always act rationally. And if you were a legislator, you would not want competition. The natural thing is to want to be able to go from election cycle to election cycle, move your ways up towards being President of the United States, which I assume a lot of them have as their ultimate objective, and not have to run the risk of being unemployed and going into the private sector, which scares the bejesus out of them. And there's no jobs. So if you, well, because of their actions, there's no jobs. And so they do what you would expect them to do. They make sure that they don't have competitive races. And as long as they are the ones that set the standards, I don't think you can expect much change. Now, it'd be interesting in New York, where Ed Koch created an organization, got a lot of them to pledge in the state Senate and Assembly, if reelected, which they all got reelected, if reelected, you will go and do fair, nonpartisan redistricting. I hope that they do what Ed has forced them to commit to, but there is a long history here of saying one thing before you get elected and doing something different afterwards. I'd be shocked if that happened again.
Is there any way you could have a binding contract?
No. No,
with a politician?
No, and at a federal level, you'd have to change the Constitution. So that's certainly not going to happen at a federal level, and there's a lot of states you'd have to change the state constitution. Some places you can do it by referendum, as I gather in Florida and in California. Some places it would be debated in the courts. Not clear how you, when we talk about fair, nonpartisan elections, it's not clear what your definition of fair is. Is it equal opportunity or equal results? And that's, the courts are all over the place on.
Okay, so your fair is in the title of your organization. How are you defining it? And if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit with everybody how you've defined the problem and the successes that you have enjoyed. I want to hear from both you and from Abel, and then I'm going to come to Congressman Castle and Governor Chris Glass to talk about how some of these changes might actually have altered the nature of the political process you've been in. But how have you dealt with some of the challenges that he was just discussing, and how do you define fair?
Well, Florida has the distinction of being pretty much the worst gerrymandered state in the country right now. We have a situation in Florida where we have about 700,000 more registered Democrats in Florida, but we have 75% now of our legislature is Republican. And that is due to the way, in large measure, to the way the districts are drawn. Now, I would say that the elected legislators think that it's due to the fact that everybody loves them very much. But the districts are drawn in such a way that whoever's drawing the districts puts the opposite party voters in large numbers into a very small number of districts, and then puts their voters into, spreads them out over twice the number of districts. So basically that's the way it's been done in Florida for years. This year, 63% of the Florida voters, in a year that was a very unusual year in Florida for many reasons, 63% said, we don't want districts that are drawn for the purpose of favoring or disfavoring a political party or an incumbent. And that, I think, spoke very loudly about the mood of Floridians. So these amendments say that districts shall not be drawn with the intent to favor or disfavor political parties or incumbents. We now have in the Constitution, along with that provision, another provision that says that minority voting rights must be maintained. Districts will now have to be compact. Presently, we have dozens of districts, literally, that go for 150 to 200 miles, splitting counties, splintering cities, and connecting areas that have very little in common. And districts will now have to be compact, and they will have to follow geographical and city and county lines to keep communities together, so that voters will be able to vote alongside their neighbors for their representatives, instead of finding that their neighbor next door is actually in a district that's totally unrelated to the district that they're in. So there is a lot of reason to think that that with fairness in redistricting, and this is supposed to take the rigging out of the districting.
Fairness through whose eyes, though? Who is the arbiter of what a fair district looks like?
Well, you know, I mean, I think, you know, it depends. I agree that the legislators think fairness is drawing a district that's going to protect themselves or their political party. This new constitutional provision that we have in Florida outlaws that, and it's fairness to the people. We are
through whose eyes, though?
Well, through the people's eyes, obviously, because 63% of them voted for these amendments. And fairness means that a district isn't rigged. It isn't set up to be either a Republican district or a Democratic district. And if, in fact, the district is rigged, you know what that means. That means that if it's a Democratic district, the representative or the member of Congress is going to be elected essentially in the primary with very little chance of a challenge from across the aisle. Yeah. And if it's a Republican district, same thing. So when you have a situation where there's no real competition of ideas in an election, who gets elected? The person who is either on the far right, if it's a Republican district, or the far left, if it's a Democratic district. And then what happens? When they get to the legislature, they almost don't know how to come together to find solutions that will work for all of Florida or all of the United States, because they've only had to listen during their elections to people that are on the extremes of their party, and that's who they have to answer to.
You were emphasizing something there.
Well, yeah, I mean, Ellen's point is well taken. When you have these districts that are drawn in such a way that it's so skewed for one party or the other, depending on what state you're in, you do get sort of what you asked for, in essence. That type of person, that model, if you will, is what gets elected. And, you know, as a former Republican, now an independent, I can speak with some authority on this, I think, at least as it relates to Florida. Ellen's exactly right. I mean, we're a state of almost 20 million people. And we have 75% of our legislators that are of the Republican Party in the House and Senate. Yet, we have 700,000 more registered Democrats in Florida than we do Republicans. And so, what does that tell you? You know, the mayor's much better at math than any of us.
Gerrymandering.
Pardon me? Well, they did. They did a very good job of it 10 years ago, and now it's upon us again.
Yeah. You have been fighting a version of this in California, more with the actual mechanism of the primary process. Tell us what you've been up to.
Well, first of all, I do agree with the redistricting initiatives that you've been pushing forward in Florida. In California, there's actually there's a 14% voter registration advantage, Democrat versus Republican, and they've managed to redistrict themselves and keep themselves in power, and it's a majority Democrat state. In California, we had Arnold Schwarzenegger. He won in an open primary. It was a recall special election. Arnold Schwarzenegger would have never become governor in California under the closed primary system that we have today. It just would have happened. So I've always said all along, you know, how do you reform the way you elect the politicians? Because right now the system that we've had in the past is the fox drawing the lines for the hens. I mean, it's what we've been doing. And they've been pretty happy. So I've worked in an open primary. I've been working on an open primary for 14 years. I was a mayor, just like Mayor Bloomberg, and we had closed sessions, and we discussed potholes, not Republican potholes or Democrat potholes. They just needed to be filled. And when I got to Sacramento, it was a caucus problem. You walked into a caucus, and it was, how do we focus, instead of health care or less taxes, how do you focus on growing the Republican Party? And I'm sure the Democrats on their side of the aisle were focused on how do they grow the Democrat Party, and no one was focused on growing California's economy. And that's the problem that we've had. That's why Proposition 14 is very important, Dylan.
Well, tell briefly, how is it that the open primary, in your view, alters the dynamic you're just describing?
I'm sitting behind some boards that say no labels, and this is fantastic. I think it's a giant step forward, and I support it, and I wish it had been there a couple of years ago, because in California, in 19 days, I wrote SB 6, Senate Bill 6, which took it to the vote of the people. We amended the Constitution. The people voted 55%. Starting in 19 days, the people of California will get to vote for their elected officials, whomever they want. Everybody's on the same ballot. Guess what? You don't have to put an R and you don't have to put a D next to your name. You just put your name and you put your ballot and title at the bottom, and the top 2 vote getters, who are the 2 best candidates, get to run off in the general election, and the people get to vote for people that are the best candidates that will have 3 qualities: open-minded, reasonable, and pragmatic, and that's what America needs today.
How would an open primary have been different in your situation, Congressman Castle? Is that even a valid?
I would be sitting next to U.S. Senator-elect Castle today.
Well, it's hard to say. It's an interesting question. It's funny, we only have 1 member of the House of Representatives. That's true of 7 states. That eliminates a lot of the federal redistricting issues, shall we say. But we do have state redistricting, which is important as well. And with Congressman John Tanner, a Democrat from Tennessee, I have introduced legislation to do exactly what we're talking about here, to have fair redistricting throughout the United States of America, which I think is essential. There are some incredible districts. My staff, in preparing for this, talked about the 17th district in Illinois, which I don't know a lot about. I don't even know who represents it, but apparently it was drawn right along a river, and it is in and out, 10 yards wide, 100 yards wide, here and there, houses excluded, that kind of thing. Democrats in that district, Republicans shoved over to other districts, that kind of business. And that's the way, unfortunately, reapportionment occurs across the United States of America, both at the state level and at the federal level. I'm delighted to hear what has happened in Florida, and I'm obviously delighted the Lieutenant Governor has led the fight for the open primary situation. I was in a primary in Delaware. Sometimes I cry when I revisit this issue, so I got to be careful. But I was in a primary in Delaware, and I was heavily favored to win the primary and even to win the general election. And the Tea Party came in and spent a great sum of money, and it took me out with a very low turnout of Republicans. It was not an open primary. I would have been better suited with an open primary. I've always had some appeal to independents and Democrats, although I have some mixed feelings about that. I mean, parties exist for a reason, so I can understand the argument that they should be closed primaries. But I can see now, much more clearly than I could before September 14th, the possibility of open primaries in this country. So I may be on your side, Lieutenant Governor.
I think you've got to be careful. There's 2 things we're talking about here: open elections and redistricting.
Totally.
And a lot of the redistricting is there for reasons they've copied the U.S. Constitution. The U.S. Constitution has 2 houses. One is proportional to the population. One, every state gets 2 votes, period, whether the state is populous or not, big, geographical, small, urban, whatever the case may be. And a lot of people would argue that is the right ways to do it, and that the Founding Fathers had that in mind. Remember, the Founding Fathers, when they originally wrote the Constitution, it basically was male, white landowners that were the only ones that had the vote. And
the good old days.
No, not the good old days. We've come a long ways, thank God, since then. But that's where the history is. The other thing is, in America, ethnicity is a very important thing. And the courts will say repeatedly, if a redistricting takes away the number of seats of ethnicity, A, B, or C, then it's not fair. And you can't have it both ways of saying we're not going to look at anything, or we're going to look, it's that equal result thing.
But you bring up an interesting point about the white male landowners, which is that the ideals of the Constitution, as laid out originally, were obviously, we felt, meaningfully short of that at the outset of this country. And over the past few hundred years, there has been an ongoing moral progression and systematic progression to expand the basic premise of equality through all people, through all, etc.
We are much more democratic and fair today than we used to be.
Without question, hugely so. I guess what I'm saying is, what is the next layer in that progression, and is the next layer in that progression, having come as far as we have already come, better fought in redistricting, better fought in primary reform? In other words, words, you're talking about the constitutional issue with redistricting relative to the structural issue.
I tried when I
primary.
first came into office. I supported, with a lot of money, an attempt to change New York City's primaries to open election, no process to open election. And we were resoundingly beaten. The city is overwhelmingly Democratic, so you'd think the Republicans would be in favor of it. No, they weren't in favor of it either. As a matter of fact, given the results, it was hard to find anybody that was in favor of it other than me. But, you know, since then, a lot of the good government groups have said, oh, yes, yes, we should have done it. And I think to myself, where were you back then? But if you want to have something that is totally open, then I don't even have a problem if you can display the R or the D next to your name, as long as everybody can put their name on the same ballot. If you think about it, our next mayoral election in 1,113 days, or whatever, I guess close to that, is going to have 6, 7 candidates probably. It'll be all Democratic, because the Democratic primary is so, Democrats are so overwhelmingly Democratic, Rudy and myself notwithstanding. And so 3 or 4% of the people, 5% of the people are going to put each of the 2 candidates in a runoff into the election, and most people just are totally disenfranchised.
Go ahead.
I think redistricting,
how do you avoid that?
Well, I think redistricting is important, and I don't want to degrade it as much as I care so much of the open primary, because even if you have a fair redistricting plan with a closed primary election, which is a midterm election where the voter turnout is lower, you still have to go to the right to win a Republican primary, and you still have to go to the left to win a Democrat primary. So that doesn't take out this partisanship out of the House. So when you put in an open primary coupled with fair redistricting, now we're rolling. And as Mayor Bloomberg talked about, you can put the R or the D. We had that in California. We had an open primary in 1998 where you still had to put an R and a D, and the Supreme Court said, well, you can't do that because every party has the right to nominate. So what we did in California this year is we asked the voters that, you know what, give the choice to the candidate to put the R or the D, and that will pass constitutional muster with the Supreme Court, and we can move forward. I think that's the game changer, Dylan, coupled with redistricting, and we can move forward. Because politicians today, I mean, think about it. I mean, you want to unite the Republican and the Democrat Party together? Introduce an open primary initiative. I mean, they hate it because you're just accountable to party bosses. So now, just briefly, Dylan, now every elected official running for office better have a message for November, because if your message is only for June, you're going to lose, because you're going to have, in California, there's going to be 2 Democrats running against each other at the top of the ticket. And I can tell you which one's going to win. The one that can get declined estates, independents, and Republicans. And that person is going to be open-minded, reasonable, and pragmatic, and we're on our way.
It is interesting to hear, yeah, please, whether, again, from this whole side of the room, if everybody doesn't want this, meaning if the incumbent political power structure does not want this, doesn't want the redistricting, doesn't want the open primaries, can align like this on a bipartisan plan to make sure it doesn't happen, should that not mean that it should be at the absolute top of the list of the problems? In other words, they're telling you what is most valuable to them. They're telling you that which is most sacred and must be protected, and were it to be threatened would truly compromise the power structure. And the American people are saying, we're not happy with the way the power structure is functioning. We believe it does not function in a fair, competitive way. If nothing else, it's almost like a scientific experiment where you try to figure out what really matters, what variable really matters, like when they're looking for a drug discovery kind of thing. Well, we found the variable that matters. At what point and what would it take, in your opinion, to organize, not just in Florida, not just in California or New York, but using, again, a platform like the one that is being discussed here today with No Labels, a coalition that can have a very clear, very easy to understand, very easy to understand, very easy to understand, which I really think, I'm emphasizing that because I think without that you're doomed, mechanism to advocate for this?
We have to do what Ellen did in Florida very successfully, and by advocating fairness, that's exactly what she did in terms of redistricting as it relates to congressional and state districts in Florida going forward. And when you over and over and over again market that in an effective way, that talks about the amendments that are going to be on the ballot. You go straight to the people, not to the parties, not to the party bosses, but straight to the people of Florida, and then they overwhelmingly pass it, not by 50%, but by 63%, because we have a higher threshold for amending our Constitution in Florida. And to her great success, you do it. Plus, you do what these signs say behind us, in my opinion. I mean, you advocate no labels, and you talk about the country before the party. You talk about the people instead of the party bosses. And I think, you know, as I travel Florida, which is one of the most diverse states in the country, and you talk to people about what they want for the future of Florida, the future of America, what they by and large talk about is they want, you know, people who are fiscally conservative, spend money wisely, as the mayor has done very successfully here in New York, but also socially moderate. Leave me alone. You know, we're an independent bunch of people. And if we provide good education that has accountability with it, we have a good defense on the national level that the congressman has fought for, and you just search for common sense, these things can happen, and America will be stronger for it.
Go ahead, Ellen.
You know, the governor points out an important thing. We put together in Florida a coalition of what used to be called good government groups, and they're almost obsolete today, right? But all of the organizations that fought for fair districts were nonpartisan. And the supporters of fair districts were nonpartisan, obviously, since we got 63% of the vote in Florida. But the campaign against fair districts, and this really relates to this no labels concept, the campaign against these two amendments was to try and label them as left-wing, left-leaning, liberal-leaning power grab. And this was, I mean, I am pleased to report that we really had a success there by having a substantive amendment that actually said, in its language, which the voters saw when they went to the polls, which actually said, districts shall not be drawn to favor or disfavor a political party or an incumbent. Voters saw through that. But it was a very, very ugly and powerfully stated campaign against trying to label these nonpartisan amendments into make them appear to be partisan in nature.
To the extent to which, though, that you're able to model any sort of effectiveness, whether it's in California with open primaries or in Florida with redistricting, what are the barriers to scaling any sort of effective solution that may exist on a state or a county level that then can be brought into and adopted into larger and larger spheres? When you look at this, and obviously you're frustrated because you'd love to be able to do some of these things, and you run into all sorts of barriers to it, but what could be done to either celebrate, amplify, or better understand what people are doing that is successful in this regard, so that the pressure to scale it into places that are perhaps more resistant to it starts to diminish?
Well, one of the things that occurs to me is it's not clear that the average voter wants what I think all of us are advocating. I mean, if you take a look at what happened in the UK, the Liberal Party was the darling of the press. Everything focused on the Liberal Party. And yes, they were the kingmakers. They got Cameron in, but the Liberal Party lost half a dozen seats in this last election. In the end, when you have an independent candidate, not always, but almost always, it is the two major parties that get most of the votes. Now, that may be people think the independent candidate can't win and they want the lesser of the other two evils or not. But it's not clear that the average person feels themselves disenfranchised or wants a lot of the things that we advocate.
At the same time, if you look at the statistics on the American view of politicians, if you look at the statistics on the American view of the incumbent power structure,
yeah, but people always say throw the bums out and then vote for them. So I don't like my postman. I don't like the Postal Service, but I love my postman. That's a phenomenon that's always been there. And a lot of it's name recognition. A lot of it is ethnic familiarity and solidarity. A lot of it is just lethargy. They don't bother. If you don't bother to vote, you help one guy or woman or the other. You know, I come back to how far this country has come from what the original framers of the Constitution envisioned. the good old days weren't always the good old days. And things are an awful lot better today where virtually everybody in theory is enfranchised. I'm sure there's some, you can argue at the margins, no, but generally we are so much better. Everybody, almost everybody has a vote.
Go ahead, Congressman.
Well, Don, I'd like to sort of change the tone for a moment. It was mentioned earlier, I think, by Joe Scarborough in terms of the funding of campaigns and the fact that more outside money was poured into these campaigns this year than through the two political parties and the candidates themselves. This has become a huge problem in America. I had the pleasure of introducing something called the Disclose Act last year, and well, it got me in a lot of political trouble. But in any event, basically it was a case called the Citizens United case in the Supreme Court a little over a year ago, I guess, which said that corporations and labor unions and even nonprofits could contribute more directly to advocacy for candidates in this country. And so a couple of it, 3 or 4 or 5 of us said fine, and we introduced this legislation. There were 2 Republicans and a group of Democrats who co-sponsored it. And basically it said if you're going to make these kinds of contributions, you need to disclose who your chief executive officer is and who your 10 largest contributors are. Well, politicians do that anyhow. That is something we have to do. Political parties do that. So we felt that they should do it. They brought it to the floor, the Democrats did, in the House of Representatives, and it passed narrowly. There were 2 Republicans who voted for it. I was one of them, and the fellow who co-sponsored it with me did not vote for it, but somebody else did. And it went on to the Senate where it was never taken up. But that is a huge problem in America. Money in politics is a tremendous issue right now out there, and I think needs to be addressed in any way we can. Now we have the spread of these outside groups coming in and getting involved with campaigns, not even going through political parties or candidates, and that's a problem. Even in this room, we have people who are advocating the public financing of campaigns. And, you know, that maybe is a multiple of small donations multiplied by something. That is something I think that we need to be considering in America today. We need to clearly deal with that particular problem. While I'm on my high horse, one other quick point that was made earlier today, too, and that is the influence of the political parties in the caucuses, particularly in Washington, D.C. I don't know if I saw it as much in Delaware when I was there, but in Washington, it's incredible, the influence of the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. They will get you in a conference room in the caucus meetings, and they will say, you've got to vote for this. You've got to oppose President Obama because that's going to get Republicans elected or whatever it may be, and they'll send out whips to try to put you in that position. And the will to stand up and say, no, I'm not going to vote that way, I'm going to vote the other way, is just something that's lost. And I see it in both parties. I mean, either more political votes, not naming post offices, but doing anything that's really meaningful. And then there's a complete choking when it comes to deficit reduction and dealing with some of the very major issues of the environment and other things that face this country. There are significant problems in how Washington in particular operates right now.
This goes right in line to what we were talking about reform. It's Congressman Castle just talked about it. It's so nothing good could come out for a reasonable and pragmatic person in a Republican caucus. I just know that. And you go in there and you start to listen, as Mike stated, we got to do this and we got to do that, and no one's talking about the big issues, the budget. I mean, the budget, Republicans don't want revenues. Democrats, they don't want to cut. So there's 3 ways to balance a budget. You can cut, you can raise revenues, or you can borrow. And if you don't want to do either of the 3, there's no leadership. And they use this labeling of a Reap or a Dem to stand behind a leader and say, well, my leader doesn't want me to do that. Yeah. And we're getting nowhere. Yeah. Immigration, comprehensive immigration reform. Nobody wants to touch it. My father was a bracero who crossed the border. Yep. In '63, his son is the lieutenant governor. Republicans should own that issue. Yeah. They're afraid. That's why we need to open up these primaries and redistricting.
Yeah, I'll leave it on this, and I think, and you really hit this point well. This country is based on a tremendous number of ideals that are tied to fairness and equality that have as yet to completely manifest themselves. However, if you look at the amount of effort, I was just up in Seneca Falls, I guess on Friday or late last week, which in addition to being the town upon which It's a Wonderful Life is based, is also the place where the women's suffrage movement started. The first women's suffrage meeting occurred in 1848. At that point in time, women were considered property. It was okay to whip them as long as the whip was narrower than the width of your thumb. Obviously, it was a slave country, et cetera, et cetera. Those people worked against those types of oppressions, which are so much more violent and so much more present in the actual lives of a disenfranchised community, or in this case, half the population, and it took them 70 years, from 1848 up through, again, their ability to vote. I really believe that this organization, that this panel, and that this particular conversation about electoral fairness and electoral reform is simply the latest chapter in an ongoing contest that has been ever present between the desire for self-preservation among all individuals and the disruptive aspects of change that cause those who are trying to preserve themselves to find themselves in a threatened position. For that reason, it should not be as frustrating as many of us find it to be that this is finding as much resistance as it does. It is natural that a conversation like this comes into a tremendous amount of resistance, and I think that that also goes to some of the civility narrative that is around this organization, because if you are accepting of the fact that the resistance to this type of change is a natural occurrence among human beings, that then that frustration will not enjoin you to respond with the level of aggression or frustration that might otherwise occur in yourself if you understand those things and understand that there obviously, as you can see on this panel, and this panel I can assure you is a fraction of the people in this country who are very much in favor of the ideas that exist here. I can't thank the five of you enough, not only for being here today, but for giving me the opportunity and the honor of being able to manage a conversation with the five of you. It's cool. And I got to wear my sneakers. Congressman Abel, Mayor, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You're watching Public Affairs